My name is Alina Vance, and I am 31 years old. The day my father passed away, the air in our living room was colder than the winter outside. My stepmother, Claire, and my half-brother, Ryan, didn't wait for the body to be cold before they started carving up the estate. They were convinced I was the uninformed daughter, the one who spent her life working in architectural restoration while they spent their time waiting for a payout. They had it all planned: a fake will, a forged signature, and a plan to sell our family estate in the countryside to a high-end luxury developer. They thought they had secured their future, and they thought I was too broken by grief to notice. But here's the thing about restoring old buildings: you learn that the foundation is everything. If you try to build a lie on a rotten foundation, the whole thing eventually collapses. They didn't know that 3 weeks before my father died, he and I had sat in his study, and I had already changed the deed to the entire estate. What happened the day they tried to evict me from my own home was a spectacle the town will be talking about for years. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where family secrets come to light and quiet strength wins the day. We tell stories about people who found the courage to break patterns that were older than they were. If stories like that speak to you, drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe, because this one goes deep. To understand why they were so bold, you have to understand how my stepmother, Claire, operated. For 15 years, she had treated our family estate like a high-stakes investment property she was waiting to flip. She was a woman who didn't care about the history of the walls, the original hand-carved mahogany, or the way the morning light hit the conservatory. She only cared about the appraisal value. My father, Arthur, had been a brilliant man, but as he grew older, he retreated into his study, leaving the daily management of our lives to Claire. She and my half-brother, Ryan, spent those years subtly isolating him, convincing him that I was too busy with my restoration projects in the city to care about the house. They created a narrative where I was the distant, ungrateful daughter, and they were the devoted caretakers. But they underestimated the bond I had with my father. He wasn't just my parent. He was the man who taught me that if you want to preserve something of value, you have to protect its structural integrity. He knew exactly what Claire was doing. He saw the way she looked at his documents, the way she hovered when he was reviewing his legal files. He wasn't senile, and he wasn't weak. He was just waiting for the right moment to outmaneuver them. I remember the last conversation we had in that study. He pulled out a worn, leather-bound volume of our property records. He didn't look at me with sadness. He looked at me with a sharp, determined clarity. "Alina," he said, his voice raspy but firm, "a house isn't a home if it's built on a foundation of greed. You are the only one who knows the history of these walls. I'm giving you the keys to the future." That was when I started the process. It wasn't just a signature. It was a complete legal restructuring of the estate's ownership. We didn't just change the will, we changed the title. The funeral was held on a Tuesday, under a sky that felt as heavy and gray as the mood inside the church. Claire arrived in a designer black veil that looked more like an accessory for a gala than a mourning shroud, and Ryan followed closely behind, his eyes constantly scanning the room, not for sympathizers, but for potential investors or partners he could leverage. I sat in the back pew, my hands folded, watching the theater unfold. They didn't know I was aware of the meeting they had held with our family attorney just 2 days after my father passed. I had installed a small, discreet digital recorder in my father's desk weeks before his death, simply because I needed to hear his voice one last time. Instead, I got an earful of Claire's plan. Through that recording, I listened to them discuss the new will, a document they had spent months drafting. Full of legal jargon that looked professional, but lacked the specific notarization markers required by state law. Claire's voice was chillingly cold as she instructed Ryan on how to bypass the probate court. "We'll file the papers while Alina is still distracted by her work," she had whispered. By the time she realizes the estate has been transferred, the deed will already be in our name and will be halfway to a closing date with the developers. Watching them at the funeral, I felt a strange, detached calm. They were grieving a payout, not a man. During the wake, Claire approached me, her face pulled into a mask of calculated sorrow. "Elena, dear," she sighed, reaching out to touch my arm with fingers that felt like cold needles. "I know how much you loved your father, but he was so forgetful toward the end. Ryan and I have found some updated instructions regarding the estate. We'll need you to vacate the grounds by the end of the week so we can prepare the property for a private sale. It's what your father would have wanted, a clean slate." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply looked her in the eye and said, "Is that so, Claire? A clean slate sounds very final. I'm sure everything is perfectly in order." Her eyes flickered with a brief, nervous twitch, but she regained her composure instantly, satisfied that her uninformed daughter had fallen for the trap. She thought I was being submissive, but in reality, I was just letting the rope play out until it was tight enough to snap. The deadline Claire set for my departure arrived on a brisk, overcast Friday morning. I was in my father's old study, not packing bags, but reviewing a set of architectural blueprints for a renovation project I had planned years ago, a project that was now, legally, entirely mine to execute. Around 10:00 a.m., the gravel in the driveway crunched under the tires of a luxury sedan. I watched from the window as Claire and Ryan stepped out, accompanied by a man in a sharp suit carrying a heavy briefcase. It was the lawyer they had hired, a man known in the county for handling high-pressure liquidations, not probate disputes. They weren't coming for a sentimental goodbye, they were coming to finalize the theft. They walked into the foyer, their footsteps echoing with an air of entitled victory. Claire was already holding a set of keys, her face set in a practiced expression of sympathetic firmness. "Elena," she called out, her voice reverberating through the hallway. "We were hoping you'd be packed by now. We have the representatives here to handle the final walkthrough and the transfer of keys. Please, let's not make this difficult. It's for the best." I walked out of the study and stood at the top of the grand staircase, looking down at them. I felt no fear, only the immense, quiet strength of knowing that the ground they were standing on had been legally locked out of their reach long before they even knew the game had started. "Difficult?" I asked, my voice calm and steady. "I'm not sure what you mean, Claire. I've been living in my home just fine." "Why would I need to make anything difficult?" Ryan stepped forward, a smug, impatient sneer on his face. "Enough of the games, Elena. We know you saw the papers. Mom has the new will, the deed is in the process of being recorded, and you don't have a legal leg to stand on. You're trespassing on property that belongs to the estate. If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the sheriff to have you removed." The lawyer opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents, waving them in the air like a flag of conquest. "Ms. Vance, I advise you to cooperate. We have a clear title transfer trajectory and the backing of the executor. Any resistance at this stage is not only futile, it is actionable in a court of law." I walked down the stairs slowly, one step at a time, letting the silence build in the room. When I reached the bottom, I didn't reach for my bags. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a single, embossed envelope, the formal notification from the county clerk of deeds. "It's interesting you mention the sheriff," I said, stopping just a few feet from them, "because I spoke with the sheriff's office this morning. Not about me trespassing, but about the fraudulent documents you've been trying to file with the county recorder for the last 3 weeks." I handed the envelope to the lawyer. He opened it, his eyes scanning the page, and the color drained from his face as quickly as if he'd been struck. The paper wasn't just a notice. It was a certified copy of the warranty deed, signed, notarized, and, most importantly, recorded by my father 3 weeks before his passing. It was a clean, irrevocable transfer of ownership. "You didn't change the deed," Claire, I said, my voice dropping to a low, clinical register that silenced the entire foyer. You attempted to forge a path to a property that you never owned. And because you were so busy rushing the process, you forgot to check the master record. I didn't realize the estate was being transferred. I was the one who authorized it. You aren't here to evict me. You're standing on private property. And you have exactly 3 minutes to get back in your car before I have the sheriff explain to you why filing a fraudulent deed is a felony. The silence in the foyer was absolute, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock that had stood in that hallway since my great-grandfather's time. The lawyer's hands trembled, the pristine document shaking in his grip like a death warrant. He looked from the deed to Claire, his eyes wide with the sudden, sharp realization that he had just put his professional license on the line for a crime that was already dead on arrival. Claire, usually so quick with a cutting remark or a polished excuse, looked as though she had been physically struck. The smug superiority she had worn for years vanished, replaced by a frantic, jagged confusion. She grabbed for the paper, her fingernails catching the edge of the heavy cardstock, but the lawyer pulled it back, shielding the seal of the county clerk as if it were a weapon. "This is a mistake," Claire whispered, her voice failing to carry the authority she had projected only moments ago. "This can't be valid. Arthur wasn't thinking clearly." He was unstable. I didn't blink. Arthur was a man who kept a record of every single transaction in this house for 40 years. "Claire," I replied, my voice hard and cold as flint. "Do you really think a man who spent his life studying the structural integrity of this family wouldn't know exactly what to do when he saw termites in the foundation? He wasn't unstable. He was preparing, and I was the one he trusted to execute the design." Ryan, realizing the trap they were in, took a step toward the door, his bravado completely disintegrated. "Mom, let's just go," he muttered, his voice cracking with the first hint of genuine fear. "We can fix this, we can." "You can't fix a felony, Ryan," I interrupted, turning my gaze fully toward him. "And you can't undo a public record. The sheriff is already aware of the discrepancy in the filings. You have 2 minutes left. I suggest you use them to drive off this property. Or you can explain to the deputies arriving at the gate why you brought forged legal documents onto private land with the intent to coerce a homeowner." The lawyer didn't wait for Claire. He turned on his heel, tucked his briefcase under his arm, and practically sprinted for the door, desperate to distance himself from the wreckage. Ryan followed, stumbling over his own feet in his haste to escape the foyer. Claire lingered for one final, venomous second, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You think you've won, Elena?" she hissed. "You're living in a museum of a dead man's dreams. You'll be bankrupt within a year trying to maintain this house, and you'll be doing it all alone." "I'm not maintaining a museum, Claire," I said, standing tall as she finally retreated into the rain. "I'm reclaiming a home. And I'd rather be alone in a house built on truth than spend another day living in a palace built on your lies." I watched from the door as their sedan spun gravel and sped away down the long, winding lane. As the taillights disappeared into the mist, the house seemed to sigh, the heavy atmosphere of the last 15 years lifting like smoke. I turned back into the foyer, the quiet of the estate finally feeling like a sanctuary instead of a cage. I had the deed, I had the history, and for the first time in my life, the future was mine to build. With Claire and Ryan gone, the true work began. For weeks, the house felt like it was exhaling, the tension that had permeated the wood and plaster finally dissipating. I didn't just want to live in the house. I wanted to honor the man who had laid the foundation, and that meant stripping away the superficial luxury Claire had installed during her tenure. I began in the attic, a space I hadn't properly entered since I was a child. Claire had used it as a storage locker for her high-end lifestyle, discarded furniture, boxes of unused high-fashion accessories, and broken decor that she hadn't bothered to repair. As I cleared out the debris, I noticed something odd about the far corner of the gable. The wallpaper, an ugly, modern pattern Claire had insisted on, didn't quite sit flush against the corner of the wall. When I peeled back the edge, I didn't find dry rot or mold. I found a hidden latch, perfectly integrated into the Victorian-era wood paneling. It was a secret crawlspace, one that had been intentionally sealed from the outside. Using a crowbar, I pried the panel loose. It wasn't just a crawlspace, it was a small, climate-controlled archive room. My father had spent the last decade of his life documenting everything. Inside were not just property deeds, but a complete, chronological log of every under-the-table payment Claire had made from the estate accounts. Every forged signature she had attempted on secondary documents, and, most shockingly, an original notarized letter from his brother, my uncle, who had been pushed out of the family business by Claire years ago. He hadn't just changed the deed, he had built an entire case. There, sitting on a small wooden pedestal in the center of the room, was a ledger titled The True History of Vance Estate. It wasn't just accounting, it was a confession. He had written it for me, anticipating that even with the deed changed, Claire would find a way to contest it. He had provided the legal roadmap to have her banned from the estate permanently, including proof of embezzlement that would make it impossible for her to ever set foot in the county again. I sat on the floor of that small, dusty room, the ledger open on my lap. I realized then that my father hadn't just saved the house. He had given me the tools to end the conflict once and for all. He knew I was the architect of my own future, and he had made sure I had the blueprints to defend it. As I read through the entries, I felt a weight leave my shoulders that I hadn't realized I was carrying. The museum of a dead man's dreams, Claire had taunted me about, wasn't a prison, it was a fortress, and I was finally ready to inhabit it. With the ledger in hand, the power dynamic shifted from a defensive posture to a total offensive. Claire and Ryan, still reeling from the encounter at the front door, were likely operating under the assumption that they could still drag this out in probate court by claiming incompetence on my father's part. They were banking on a slow, expensive legal battle that would drain my resources and force me to sell the house just to pay the bills. They didn't know I now held the nuclear option. On Monday morning, I met with the district attorney's office. I didn't come with a handful of accusations and a request for a hearing. I came with a master-indexed file, the ledger my father had left behind, organized by date, transaction, and signature. I had the canceled checks from the estate accounts, the fraudulent loan applications Claire had submitted in my father's name, and the documented pattern of financial abuse that had been going on for years. The assistant district attorney, a man who had seen many family disputes, spent 4 hours going through the evidence. By the time he reached the section on the forged real estate filings, his tone had changed completely. He wasn't looking at a domestic squabble anymore. He was looking at a textbook case of wire fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. Vance, he said, closing the file with a heavy thud, if even half of this is corroborated by the bank records, this isn't a civil matter. This is a criminal investigation. Your stepmother and brother aren't just looking at losing their claim to this house. They're looking at serious prison time. I didn't smile, I just nodded. They wanted to liquidate my inheritance to fund their lifestyle, Mr. Miller. I'm simply making sure the state is aware of their business model. By Wednesday, the notices had been served. The estate's accounts were frozen by court order, meaning every dime Claire and Ryan had been using to fight me was now locked away as part of the evidence. I received a frantic, incoherent call from Ryan at 3:00 a.m., screaming that his credit cards had been declined at a hotel in the city and that he couldn't even pay for a cab. I didn't say a word. I let him yell until his voice broke, then I simply hung up the phone and turned it off. The final act was a meeting at the county courthouse. Claire arrived looking like the ghost of the woman who had stood in my foyer only days before. Her lawyer had dropped her, and she was forced to represent herself in the initial hearing. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for a shred of the family loyalty she had spent 15 years betraying. I looked back at her with the same calm, unyielding focus I had used to restore my father's study. I wasn't the uninformed daughter anymore. I was the one holding the gavel. The hearing room was stark and smelled of floor wax and old paper, a sharp contrast to the velvet-draped world Claire had tried to inhabit. When the judge entered, the air tightened. There was no room for performance here. There was only the cold, hard evidence on the table. I sat with my back straight, watching as Claire's motions to dismiss were systematically dismantled. The assistant district attorney didn't need to raise his voice. He simply laid out the ledger. Every forged signature, every unauthorized withdrawal, and the timeline of the deed modification were presented not as opinions, but as facts. When the judge looked at Claire and asked if she had any evidence to refute the document showing the deed transfer prior to my father's passing, she could only stare at her hands. She had nothing. The clean slate she had dreamed of was now a criminal record. The judge's ruling was swift. The fraudulent will was declared void. The deed was affirmed in my name, and the restraining order I had requested against them was granted indefinitely. As Claire was escorted out of the building to face her initial arraignment, she turned back one last time. For a moment, the mask slipped, and I saw a woman who was truly, profoundly terrified, not because she was sorry, but because she finally realized that the power she thought she possessed was entirely borrowed, and she had run out of time to pay it back. I walked out of the courthouse into the crisp afternoon air. The weight of the last few months, and indeed the last 15 years, fell away. The house on the estate is finally quiet. I've begun the restoration I always dreamed of, stripping away the artificial layers and revealing the original, sturdy bones of the structure. I work with the windows open, letting the sunlight flood into rooms that were once shadowed by secrets. I've turned my father's study into a workspace for my architecture firm, keeping his leather-bound ledger on the desk as a reminder. No matter how complex the structure, if the foundation isn't built on truth, it will never stand. Ryan is currently living in a studio apartment in the city, working a job he never thought he'd have to take, while Claire faces the reality of a lengthy legal battle she cannot win. They are no longer part of my story, and I am no longer a character in theirs. I stood on the porch this morning, watching the sunrise over the fields my father loved. The estate is not just a collection of rooms. It is a legacy that I have earned through silence, strategy, and the courage to hold on to the truth when everyone else was shouting lies. I am Alina Vance, and for the first time in my life, I am finally home. The court case was won, but the house itself held memories that weren't so easily evicted. Even with the legal battles behind me, the estate felt like it was holding its breath. Every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of the window panes in the wind, felt like a residual echo of the years Claire had spent trying to mold this place into something it wasn't. One evening, while working late in the study, I heard a sound from the basement that didn't belong. It wasn't the settling of wood or the humming of the pipes. It was a rhythmic, metallic tapping, tap, 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 coming from behind the wall of the old boiler room. I grabbed my flashlight and descended into the cold, damp darkness of the basement. The air down here smelled of rust and unresolved history. I moved toward the sound, my heart hammering against my ribs. I knew the blueprints of this house better than anyone, but the wall behind the boiler was thick, reinforced brick, something my father had installed long ago. I pushed aside some old lumber and saw it, a small, loose brick near the floor, vibrating slightly with every tap. I pulled the brick out. Behind it wasn't a pipe or a structural beam. It was a small, locked iron box, bolted into the foundation itself. It was the only thing in the house my father hadn't mentioned in his ledger. Why would he hide something so carefully within the very foundation of the estate? I pried the box loose and brought it back up to the light of the study. My hands were shaking. I used a small screwdriver to force the rusted lock. Inside, there were no deeds, no ledgers, and no money. There was a single, heavy brass key and a photograph. A photograph of a woman I didn't recognize, standing in front of this very house, dated 1985. On the back, in my father's handwriting, it simply said, "The one who actually built this foundation, she never got to see the finished room." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The history of this house, the history my father had protected so fiercely, wasn't just about money or greed, it was about a secret. And the key in the box wasn't for the house, it was for a door I didn't even know existed. The brass key was heavy, cool to the touch, and etched with an intricate, almost serpentine design that felt completely out of place in a house of such classic, restrained architecture. I spent the next 3 days scouring the blueprints, comparing every room, every hallway, and every closet to the physical structure of the estate. I measured the thickness of the walls, looking for discrepancies in the floor plan. It wasn't until the fourth morning, while moving a heavy, floor-to-ceiling mahogany cabinet in the library, that I noticed a hairline fracture in the crown molding above the door. It wasn't damage, it was a mechanism. I pressed firmly against the molding, and with a soft, mechanical click, a section of the bookshelves swung inward. It wasn't a standard hidden door. It was a narrow, vertical service shaft that had been converted into a small observation deck. At the end of this dark, cramped space was a heavy, iron-bound door, the lock that matched my brass key. My heart was in my throat as I inserted the key. It turned with a heavy, satisfying thunk. Inside was not a room, but a private library vault that Claire had never discovered. The walls were lined with original architectural sketches of the estate, but they were dated long before my grandfather had supposedly built the house. More importantly, there were letters, hundreds of them, between my father and the woman in the photograph. Her name was Evelyn. She wasn't just a visitor. She had been the master architect behind the estate's unique, energy-efficient design, a secret my family had claimed as their own invention for generations. But that wasn't the deepest secret. Tucked behind the letters were legal documents that blew the entire history of our wealth apart. The house hadn't been bought by my grandfather. It had been held in trust for Evelyn's family, and my father had been keeping it safe, waiting for the right moment to return it to her heirs, to her daughter. I looked at the birth certificate attached to the final legal brief. The dates, the signatures, the location of the birth. It all aligned perfectly with a name I had seen on a different document in my own office. My mother's maiden name was listed as the guardian of Evelyn's child. I wasn't just a descendant of the Vance estate. I was the bridge to the truth, and my father hadn't just been hiding property deeds. He had been hiding a secret identity that linked our family to a legacy of theft. I realized then that Claire hadn't been the only one stealing. The entire foundation of our noble family name was built on a stolen design and a discarded woman. I sat in that dark, quiet room, surrounded by the ghosts of a legacy that wasn't mine. The house was mine, but the truth was much, much larger. And now, I had to decide if I was going to be the one to finally set the record straight, or if I would carry the burden of this secret just like my father had. The silence in the hidden room was suffocating. I held the birth certificate in my hand, the paper thin and brittle, yet it carried the weight of an entire generation of deception. If I revealed this, the house, the very thing I had fought so hard to reclaim, would likely be stripped from me by legal heirs of the rightful family. I had fought Claire to protect this estate, but now I realized the estate itself was a monument to a crime I was now the guardian of. I paced the narrow library vault, my mind racing through the legal implications. If I burned these papers, I could continue living here, keeping the legacy intact, and no one would ever know. I could sell the estate in a few years, move away, and leave the ghosts behind. It was what Claire would have done. It was what my father had been tempted to do for decades. But then I looked at the photograph of Evelyn again. She looked determined, intelligent, exactly like the woman I was trying to become. My father hadn't left this room for me to hide. He had left it as a test. He had hidden it so that only someone who truly understood the structural integrity of the house, someone who cared about the foundation rather than the facade, would ever find it. I spent the night reading every letter. They weren't just business notes. They were a love story that had been forced into the shadows by the greed of my grandfather. My father had been paying reparations anonymously for years, trying to balance the ledger, but he had run out of time. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a long, golden light through the library, I made my decision. I wouldn't burn the past. I wouldn't become the thief Claire accused me of being. I took my laptop into the vault and began to digitize everything. I wasn't going to surrender the house. I was going to transform it into the restitution it was always meant to be. I reached out to a legal firm that specialized in historical land disputes, not the kind that handled liquidations, but the kind that handled justice. I wasn't going to call the sheriff this time. I was going to call the descendants. The process would be long, and it would involve public scrutiny. But for the first time, I felt like the foundation beneath my feet was finally, truly solid. I closed the iron-bound door and locked it. I had a long road ahead of me, but I was no longer the daughter of a stolen legacy. I was the architect of the truth. The days that followed were a whirlwind of quiet, calculated preparation. I didn't announce my plans to the local community, nor did I let the fear of losing my home paralyze me. Instead, I approached the historical land disputes firm with full transparency. When the senior partner finally looked over the scanned documents and the original ledger I provided, he was silent for a long time. "Elena," he said, looking over his spectacles, "you realize that by coming forward with this, you are effectively challenging your own inheritance. You are placing the entire estate in a state of limbo until we can trace the current heirs of Evelyn's line." "I know," I replied firmly, "but the house was never ours to own. It was ours to hold." My father understood that, and I am simply finishing the design he started. I didn't wait for the world to catch up. I launched a private outreach campaign, using the clues buried in Evelyn's letters to track down her family. It took weeks of research and multiple trips to the city archives, but eventually I found them. They weren't wealthy socialites or high-end developers. They were a family that had been struggling for generations, never knowing that their true heritage had been stripped away and turned into a symbol of a family that had never earned it. The meeting took place in the very study where I had first realized the truth. When the great-granddaughter of Evelyn, a young woman named Sarah who worked as a teacher, walked into the room. She looked around with a sense of wonder that I had never felt in all my years of living there. "I heard stories about this place," she whispered, her eyes watering. "My grandmother always said it was supposed to be our home, but the records were all gone. We thought it was just a family myth." I handed her the brass key and the original sketches I had found in the vault. "It's not a myth," I said. "And it's time it came back to you." The legal process was complex, but because I had voluntarily come forward with the ironclad evidence, I was able to negotiate a settlement that allowed me to remain as the estate steward during the transition, ensuring the preservation of the architecture while the transfer was finalized. I didn't lose everything, I lost the weight of a lie. I'm still here in the house, but it feels different now. The walls no longer hold secrets, they hold a story that has finally been told. Claire and Ryan are a distant memory, caught in the web of their own legal failures, while Sarah and her family are preparing to take their rightful place in the legacy of this estate. I set out to reclaim my home, but I ended up reclaiming my integrity. My father was right, the foundation is everything, and for the first time, I know exactly what mine is built on. Sarah, the young teacher, moved into the guest wing of the estate while the legal transition was in its early stages. At first, everything seemed harmonious. She was grateful, humble, and deeply connected to the architectural history of the place. But as the weeks passed, I noticed subtle shifts in her behavior. She started asking questions about the estate's liquid assets, not just the property. She began inquiring about the trusts my father had established for the Vance family line, questioning why a steward like me should still have access to the main accounts. I had been so focused on righting a historical wrong that I had ignored the most basic human reality. Power changes people, and the promise of wealth can corrupt even the most humble soul. One night, I found Sarah in the library, not reading the architectural logs, but going through my father's personal desk, the very desk where I had found the evidence of Claire's embezzlement. She wasn't looking for Evelyn's history. She was looking for bank routing numbers. When I confronted her, the mask she had been wearing slipped, and I saw a look of cold, predatory calculation that was eerily familiar. "You think you're so noble, Alina," she sneered, her voice dropping the soft, grateful tone she had perfected. "You gave up the title, you gave up the prestige. You're just a glorified caretaker now. But this money, this was meant to be ours by blood. You don't get to decide how we spend it." She wasn't looking for justice. She was looking for a payout. She had discovered that my father had set aside a massive contingency fund to ensure the estate would remain solvent for 50 years, and she wanted it all liquidated. Regardless of the historical preservation mandate I had fought to protect. She was already in contact with the same high-end liquidators Claire had used. I stood there, paralyzed by the irony of it all. I had spent months fighting to hand over a legacy, only to realize I had traded a villain I understood for a predator I hadn't seen coming. My father's ledger sat on the table between us, a silent witness to a cycle of greed that seemed built into the very limestone of the foundation. I had successfully evicted the ghost of Claire, only to invite a new nightmare into the house. Part 14. The second betrayal, the realization that I had been played, felt like a jagged blade against my ribs. Sarah wasn't a victim of history. She was an opportunist who had been waiting for the exact moment the Vance estate became vulnerable. She knew that by legalizing the transfer, I had effectively weakened my own authority within the house. She had lawyers of her own now, colder, sharper, and far more aggressive than the ones Claire had employed. By the end of the week, I received a formal notice to vacate the master quarters. Sarah had petitioned the court to classify my presence in the estate as disruptive to the preservation of the property. It was a masterclass in manipulation. She was using the very preservation laws I had championed against me. She argued that my emotional attachment to the house was a liability to its historical integrity. I watched from the foyer as she brought in an interior design team, not to restore, but to stage. They were stripping the walls, covering the mahogany with cheap, trendy aesthetic panels, and turning the private library vault into a content studio for her social media. Every hammer blow against the wall felt like a strike against my own resolve. I retreated to the carriage house at the edge of the property, my belongings packed into a few cardboard boxes. I felt defeated, exhausted, and profoundly foolish. I had spent so much energy trying to be the good person that I hadn't realized I was being dismantled by someone who had no intention of being good at all. But as I sat in the dim light of the carriage house, I remembered something I had overlooked. When I had digitized the ledger, I hadn't just copied the documents. I had kept the original, encrypted files, the ones that didn't just track the money, but tracked the provenance of the estate's artifacts. My father had been a collector as much as an architect. He had hidden away dozens of original pieces, paintings, sculptures, and historical documents that were worth more than the house itself. They were tucked away in a specialized climate-controlled vault in the city, registered under a trust that Sarah hadn't even found yet because she was too blinded by the house. She wanted the house. She could have it, but she didn't have the soul of it. And without the assets to maintain the structural integrity she claimed to care about, she was living on a sinking ship. She had the title, but she didn't have the capital. And the trust documents were very clear. If the property maintenance fell below a certain standard, the estate would revert to the public record as a protected monument, effectively stripping her of all rights to live in or profit from it. I wasn't done. I was just changing the playing field. I spent the next 48 hours in the carriage house, not wallowing but working. I had the trust documents, and I had the precise technical requirements my father had filed with the Historical Society decades ago. These weren't just guidelines, they were legally binding mandates. The estate wasn't just a house. It was a registered landmark, and Sarah's content studio renovations were in flagrant violation of at least 4 separate local preservation ordinances. I didn't call the police. I didn't scream at the front door. Instead, I contacted the Historic Landmark Commission and the Zoning Board. I provided them with the original architectural blueprints and the notarized maintenance standards my father had established. Within 24 hours, an inspector arrived at the estate. I watched from the carriage house window as the inspectors marched up the front steps, their clipboards held like shields. Sarah met them with the same arrogant smirk she'd used on me, probably expecting to bribe them or dismiss them as easily as she'd dismissed my claims to the property. But these weren't greedy developers. They were civil servants with the power of the law behind them. When they entered the library, now stripped and staged, the lead inspector's face turned stony. He walked over to the wall where Sarah had ripped out the original wainscoting and pointed directly to the violation. I could hear her voice rising, shrill and desperate, echoing across the lawn. She was demanding they leave, threatening to sue them, calling them names. She was unraveling just like Claire had. By the time they left, she had been issued a stop work order and a massive fine that was due within 5 days. Her bank accounts, which I knew were already strained from the legal fees of the house takeover, couldn't handle the blow. But I wasn't finished. I had one more move. I reached out to the local community college's architecture department and the Historical Society. I offered them the collection, the paintings, the sculptures, and the original sketches as a permanent, tax-exempt endowment to the university. The value was enormous, and by transferring it into this trust, it was legally shielded from any claims Sarah could ever make against the estate. She wanted the house as a trophy? Fine. But I had just turned it into a prison. Without the artifacts, without the endowment funds, and under the crushing weight of the preservation fines, the house was no longer an asset. It was a financial drain that would bankrupt her in less than 6 months. She had stolen the foundation, but she hadn't realized that the foundation was already collapsing under her feet. She thought she was the owner. She was actually just the caretaker of a monument to her own greed. The winter set in early, and with it, the cracks, both literal and metaphorical, began to show. The estate, a masterpiece of 19th century engineering, required a delicate balance of temperature and humidity control that Sarah was completely incapable of maintaining. Without the endowment funds I had moved to the university trust, she couldn't afford the specialized maintenance crews. And she certainly didn't have the technical knowledge to keep the climate control systems running. I watched from a distance, not as an enemy, but as a spectator, as the content studio dream began to rot. The moisture levels in the walls spiked, causing the cheap aesthetic panels she had installed to warp and peel away, revealing the beautiful, original mahogany underneath that she had cruelly covered up. The roof, which had survived a century of storms, developed a leak in the north wing because she had refused to pay for the preventative maintenance schedule my father had set. By January, the estate was freezing. The heat pumps, which were calibrated to run on a specific energy-efficient loop, failed because Sarah had bypassed the sensors to try and save on electricity. The pipes in the grand foyer burst, turning the marble floor into a sheet of ice. She came to the carriage house one evening. She wasn't the arrogant predator from months ago. She looked haggard, her coat thin, her hands trembling from the cold. She didn't knock, she just stood in the doorway, staring at the warmth of the fire I had built. "The house is dying, Alina," she said, her voice hollow. "The pipes are frozen, the basement is flooded, and the Historical Society is threatening to seize the property for negligence. I don't have the money to fix it, I don't even have the money to heat it. I didn't invite her in." I stood in the doorway, looking past her at the dark silhouette of the estate against the snow-covered hills. "The house isn't dying, Sarah. It's just rejecting you. You wanted the title, you wanted the control, but you never respected the structural integrity. You thought you could strip the history and keep the wealth, but they are the same thing." "I'll give it back," she whispered. "I'll sign it all back to you. Just help me fix the damage. Please." I looked at her, and for a moment I felt a flicker of sympathy. But then I remembered the way she had gutted the library, the way she had treated my father's legacy like a piece of meat. "The house is no longer mine to take back, Sarah. It belongs to the court-appointed receivership now. Your negligence forced their hand. You're not being evicted by me, you're being evicted by your own incompetence." She fell to her knees in the snow, but I simply closed the door. I knew that by morning, she would be gone, leaving behind nothing but the wreckage of her ambition. The house would be empty again, cold and silent, waiting for someone who understood what it meant to build something that was meant to last. The legal process to turn the estate into a public historical site moved into its final gear. Sarah was served with a permanent injunction, barring her from the property and holding her personally liable for the restoration costs. She left the county within 48 hours, leaving behind a car full of her belongings and a mountain of debt. I stood on the porch of the carriage house one last time, watching the sheriff's car pull away from the main entrance, leaving the estate shuttered and padlocked. The long, exhausting war for the house was over. I had lost the property, I had lost the inheritance, but I had saved the soul of the place. And as I turned away to start my own life, far from the shadows of that house, I realized I had won something much more valuable: my freedom. Leaving the estate behind wasn't the heartbreak I expected it to be. As I drove down the winding gravel driveway, the same road I had traveled 1,000 times as a child, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I had spent years defining myself by the walls of that house, by the secrets it held, and by the people who tried to steal it. Now, for the first time, I was just Alina. Not the architectural steward, not the uninformed daughter, and not the dispossessed heir. Just Alina. I moved to a small coastal town 300 miles away, a place where no one knew the name Vance, where the architecture was modest and honest, and where I could start a practice based on the lessons I had learned the hard way. I didn't want to build monuments to greed anymore. I wanted to build structures that served people, structures that felt like homes, not fortresses. The transition was quiet. I took a job as a lead architect for a community-focused firm, working on schools, libraries, and affordable housing. It was humbling work, far removed from the marble foyers and hidden vaults. There was no prestige here, but there was a sense of purpose that had been missing from my life for years. One afternoon, about 6 months after I left the estate, I received a thick envelope in the mail. It was from the executor of my father's estate. I opened it with trepidation, half expecting more legal headaches. But inside was a final letter from my father, addressed to me and dated the day before he died. "My dearest Alina," the letter read, "if you are reading this, you have likely discovered the truth about the estate. You have been burdened with the weight of our family's history, and I am sorry for that. But you have also shown the strength to dismantle it. The house was a test. not of your ability to hold property, but of your ability to let go. You have earned your freedom. Attached are the deeds to a small plot of land by the ocean, a gift free of any legacy, any history, and any strings. Build your own home there. Not for me, not for the family, but for yourself. Enclosed was the deed to a stunning, rugged piece of cliffside land overlooking the sea. It was a blank slate. No mahogany paneling, no hidden archives, no shadows of stolen designs, just the wind, the salt spray, and the horizon. I stood on that cliffside a week later. The air was clean and bracing. I took the architect's pencil from my pocket, the same one my father had given me when I was 12, and I began to sketch. I didn't draw a grand estate. I drew a small, bright house designed to catch the first light of dawn. I was finally building something that was truly mine. The war for the Vance estate had defined my past, but the peace of this cliffside would define my future. The cycle of theft, secrets, and retribution was broken, and I was finally, truly moving forward.